Good morning. It is Monday, March the 14th, and this is The Drill. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Daily Declaration for Spiritual Warfare, the Pledge of Allegiance, and the Star-Spangled Banner, we will have the Snowflakes, No Free Lunch, and Unseen Rights. All that and more when I come back. Thank you. And now the Daily Declaration for Spiritual Warfare for March 14th. I will cleanse your life from secret faults. My child, be aware of the danger of trying to hide your faults or actions from me, for I see the hidden secrets in your heart. Nothing can be hidden from the light of my presence. You were once darkness, but now you are light in me. Live as children of light, for my light consists in all goodness, righteousness, and truth. And find out what pleases me. Have nothing to do with the fruitless deeds of darkness, but rather expose them. Everything exposed by my light becomes visible, for it is light that makes everything visible. Be very careful how you live, not as unwise by as wise, making the most of every opportunity because the days are evil. Psalm 19, verses 12 through 13, Jeremiah chapter 23, verse 24, and Ephesians chapter 5, verses 8 through 16. Prayer declaration. Lord, cleanse my life from secret faults. I renounce secret shameful ways. I will not use deception, nor will I distort the word of God. The only thing that I will hide in my heart is the word of God, so that I might not sin against you. Amen. And that was the Daily Declaration for Spiritual Warfare for March the 14th. Thank you. Who is the true conservative? He is religious and realistic. He is the person that understands that culture is the foundation for politics. He acknowledges a benevolent universe. He is patriotic and uses common sense. He makes judgments, refuses to speculate, speaks clearly and definitively, and is not afraid to say no. He's open-minded, asking why rather than why not. He is consistent, credible, and influential, not ashamed of his existence, unafraid to learn or correct his mistakes. He is a normal American. Thank you, thank you. What are the true conservative tactics in support of the true conservative strategy to defeat the socialists? Number one, don't be intimidated. Number two, don't prove a negative. Number three, don't be neutral. And number four, don't take their word for it. Thank you, thank you. So what is the true conservative strategy for defeating the socialists politically in this country? It is to attack the socialists from the bottom up, to demoralize and defeat the rank and file socialist that we encounter each and every day. And by so doing, we will discourage them from returning people like Nancy Pelosi to office. Thank you, thank you. What are the true conservatives' political priorities? Number one, the abolition of abortion throughout the country. Number two, making nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons obsolete. Number three, the decertification of public employee unions throughout the country. And number four, assigning criminal and civil liability to all regulators across the country. Thank you, thank you. And now there's no free lunch. The art of economics consists in looking not merely at the immediate, but at the longer effects of any act or policy. It consists in tracing the consequences of that policy not merely for one group, but for all groups. Henry Hazlitt. Astute readers will note that this sentiment is nearly identical to what Bastiat communicated in the preceding entry. Hazlitt here elaborated on Bastiat's 19th century work to popularize the broken window fallacy and provide a framework for how we understand all misguided economic thinking. And that was, there's no free lunch. Good morning. It is Sunday, March the 13th. This is The Drill, and this is a supplementary edition of The Drill. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So this supplementary edition, I'm going to be reading an article from American Conservative Magazine, the current edition, and it's an excellent piece, and why it's excellent will become readily apparent. So it's written by Jeffrey Polet, P-O-L-E-T, and the title is The Makers of the Snowflake Generation, and the subtitle is If Millennials Are Fragile, it's because their teachers and institutions have made them that way for their own self-interest. When our children were young and would fall, they would look at me to gauge my reaction. If I responded with, "Oh my goodness, are you okay?" they would inevitably start crying. If I told them to shake it off, they'd get up and go about their business. Kids are naturally resilient, but they can become thin-skinned and neurotic if constantly subjected to parental overreaction. A certain amount of benevolent neglect goes a long way. Being thick-skinned and tough-minded are valuable characteristics for children to develop as they learn to navigate this world. This observation echoes one of the central claims of the book, The Coddling of the American Mind, namely that when we tell students they are unsafe, they internalize the claim and come to believe that the world is a hazardous place. As a result, students become increasingly fragile and unable to deal with the friction and disappointment of social life. We would do well to remind them that a useful life is marked by struggle, hardship, failure, difficulty, and pain. We can try to insulate ourselves from all that, but we would become genuine good-for-nothings in the process. Goethe noted that all regressive regimes become obsessed with subjectivity and elevate feeling over reason. The tyranny of feeling sociology, Robert Nisbet argued, marked life in an iron age, the last stage of civilizational decline. We are to take feelings as both ineluctable and authoritative, just as we are to take lived experience as a special form of experience that justifies any interpretation of it. Referring to lived experience, like feeling, is not an invitation to conversation, but a barrier to it. Psychobabble and its laser focus on feeling encourages egoism. And it's the worst kind of egoism, because it stipulates that any insult the self experiences has to be recognized by everyone else as an insult. In the absence of any code of honor, insult becomes purely subjective. It is impermissible to suggest that someone is thin-skinned and needs to toughen up. Instead, we need to nod thoroughly, purse our lips, furrow our brows, and be empathetic, which really means enmeshed in the other's feelings. Heaven forbid we should say the obvious. The world is a tough and indifferent place where most people you run into won't care about your feelings. They'll only care whether you live up to your responsibilities. Minimally, we might try to see a middle ground between those two things. William James noted that philosophy needed to be both tough-minded and tender-minded thinkers, but we have become all tenderness and use very little of our minds. Nisbet lamented his era of self-spelunking, awareness intoxication, and ego diving. Fate spared him our present moment. One expects teenagers to be all passion and no reason, and one expects them to be egocentric. But it's habits. Instead, our schools, primary, secondary, and post-secondary, not only encourage the behavior, they denounce any resistance to it as a form of the boogeyman the students are told to fear. The people who run our institutions actively frame the students' experience of the world with the intention of making them feel frightened, unsafe, and harmed. That frame is pathological because it's less concerned with the students' well-being than confirming the ideological preferences of faculty and staff. More to the point, it's an abuse of power. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now back to the article called The Makers of the Snowflake Generation. Last fall, leaders at my college, and it could be virtually any place in the country, in preparation for the presidential election, decided we needed to create, quote, election safe spaces, unquote. Uncertain about the election's outcome, the enablers anticipated that, quote, students will need assistance, unquote, in, quote, addressing their needs, unquote, with the clear implication that these needs were limited to students whose candidate lost, assuming the candidate was a Democrat. The school also provided a website for, quote, election incident reports, unquote, in case students encountered someone who voted Republican. Members of our community were admonished that the stress and anxiety associated with the election could best be dealt with by setting up faculty-supervised safe spaces, replete with coloring books and snacks, and the black students could sign on to buddy walks with white students who would accompany them across campus in case the holding of a democratic election made them feel unsafe. The same college, in the wake of the death of George Floyd, decided not only to confess its institutional racism, but additionally felt the need to institute critical race theory as its institutional framework of analysis. A cynic might say that if racism were as rampant as suggested, a lot of people should have lost their jobs, particularly those running the departments and offices that were issuing confessions. There's something especially peculiar about a department chair confessing that her department is racist and then expecting not to be held accountable. But no, instead, the school installed a whole new feeling management apparatus, providing students with the psycho chic equivalents of blankies and teddy bears. As it turned out, Biden won, and all the pre-election hand-wringing was for naught. Undaunted, noting students' deep hurts in the wake of recent headlines about anti-Asian violence and the ongoing Derek Chauvin trial, administrators at Hope suggested that faculty's primary task was to be empathetic, yet another noble concept unlikely to survive its promiscuous abuse. Operating on the assumption that students had already experienced trauma in their short lives, administrators admonished faculty not to re-traumatize students by teaching ideas rather than feelings. The school further claimed that, quote, trauma-informed educational practice shares key principles to universal design learning theories, unquote. I challenge anyone to make sense of that sentence. As the end of the Chauvin trial drew near, so did the intense focus on the students' quote, lament, pain, and struggle, unquote. School needed to draw its attention and resources to lightening, quote, the emotional load, unquote, on students who were said to be living in very challenging times. Community members were expected to allow space for the multitudes of ways of grieving and lamenting. Note that no accommodation was made for those who would not be grieving and lamenting the results of a trial in which no one had a direct stake. For to demonstrate such repose would be morally objectionable and make one complicit in racism. Nor were we permitted to think that, under the rule of law, Chauvin might be determined not guilty, or that such a verdict could even be legitimate. Nor was it suggested that empathy might, in principle, be extended to Chauvin's family. Absent in all those question-begging emails were references to learning, teaching, subject matter, rational and open debate, the exploration of ideas, or the promotion of knowledge. Once the Chauvin trial proved spent in ginning up outrage, emboldened by the tyranny of feeling, faculty and administrators found a convenient new target in our women's softball team, who had the misfortune of celebrating Cinco de Mayo while wearing sombreros. A sober analysis would ask exactly where the wearing of sombreros, which the students purchased at a local store with the encouragement of its Mexican owners, falls on the scale of cultural insensitivity. With wearing blackface to a party at the impermissible end and eating tacos and drinking margaritas while white on the permissible end. But no such analysis was forthcoming. Rather, the determination that wearing a sombrero is the equivalent of blackface rested on the authority of the feelings of one student who claimed implausibly that seeing white girls wear sombreros was traumatizing. The softball players might be forgiven for not realizing that the feelings of one person had unlimited power to slide the scale, or that such recalibration happens only after the crime has occurred. Faculty and administrators immediately sprang into action, not by correcting the accuser, nor even by listening thoughtfully to both sides, but by conceding the legitimacy of the claim and going after the poor softball players. Faculty were encouraged to use class time to help students process their feelings, leading me to wonder which part of the cardiovascular system instructors in anatomy and physiology were to skip. The sacrifice of young women to the jealous god of anti-racism was accompanied, as one would expect, by sackcloth and ashes confessions of institutional racism with a promise to mend one's ways. At no point did anyone publicly suggest that maybe we were overreacting a little and our community norms of belonging, understanding, and grace ought to extend to white softball players as well. Little attention is paid to the ways in which faculty and staff prime students to have emotional responses to events that do not directly affect students or of which they have insufficient knowledge to make reasoned judgments. Feelings don't deal well with complexity. That's reason's province. A world where only feelings matter is one requiring constant oversimplification. Many students would happily go about their business were it not for faculty and staff constantly telling them what they should be upset about. Most students would shrug their shoulders at the outcome of a presidential election had faculty not begun class by literally crying over the results. That is, the faculty who could actually rally themselves to hold class. A lot of classes got canceled the day after the 2016 election. I can honestly say, and I teach political science, that I've never canceled a class after any election, and I've never tipped my hand as to how I feel about the results. Why would I abuse my authority to privilege my feelings? The students have material to learn, and my job is to teach, not emote. It is not in the interest of students to elevate feeling at all cost and put into place obviously infantilizing practices and policies. Many students, if faculty and staff took the time to listen to them instead of telling them how they're supposed to feel, think that most of these communications and institutionalized responses are insulting. Students recognize that the main impetus for the tyranny of feeling is not the well-being of the students, but the professional, ideological, and institutional interests of faculty and apparatchiks in student life, who justify their existence and increase their power by exacerbating students' grievances. A lot of students would rather focus on their education and career prospects, and they'd much rather faculty did the same for them. It's morally disastrous to define deviancy down, and it's educationally disastrous to define the strength of community by its weakest members. Back in a minute. Thank you. Here we go. Yet, this is consistently what we do. We neither privilege the normal case nor uphold standards of excellence. Indeed, we are actively engaged in redefining excellence. We do not insist on strength of character or resilience in the face of adversity. Instead, we set our standards and policies to accommodate the intellectually weakest and most psychically fragile of our students, many of whom probably shouldn't be in college to begin with. Students take their cues from those in authority, those whom they look up to and trust. If we go about our business and do our jobs, the students will follow. But if we keep sending them messages that they ought to be upset and crying, we shouldn't be surprised when they are upset and crying. We might even like these tears if they create an opportunity for us to demonstrate publicly our sensitivity and virtue. Matters are made worse when we exaggerate the nature of both the problem and the students' reactions to it. Heterodox ideas don't make people unsafe. Someone's disagreement with a policy isn't harmful. Normal, psychologically healthy people don't get frightened when someone disagrees with them. The people in authority don't really believe that either. They use these words not because they accurately describe anything, but because they are psychological weapons to silence their opponents. It's cynical. Worst of all is the promiscuous use of the word trauma. Trauma is serious business. It's the reaction people have when they have witnessed something truly horrific: war, a violent death, the unexpected loss of a loved one. Trauma will render them unable to function, at least temporarily, in daily life. The traumatized person will replay images in their mind that they can't stop. Nothing will ever be the same for a traumatized person. Trauma is life-altering. We need that word, and one way to devalue the meaning of any word is to overuse it or misuse it. A student who can't function because a professor used a word that sounds too much like an N-word, or had students read a book that has that word in it, or feels unsafe because the professor had the temerity to investigate a concept that the student, in all her wisdom and experience, decides is beyond the pale. This student is either performing, trying to get out of something, or in serious need of psychological help. Perhaps the best therapy is simply to shrug it off. They can survive a skinned knee. And Jeffrey Pollette, who's the author of this particular article, is a professor of political science at Hope College in Holland, Michigan. And again, the title of this article was "The Makers of the Snowflake Generation," and it comes from the conservative magazine Current Issue. Thank you. And now, from the book Government Against Itself, Chapter 3, The Unseen Rights Revolution. Organized labor in the United States has been transformed. It is no longer concentrated in the private sector, with blue-collar workers in manufacturing and the building trades filling the ranks. For the first time, in 2009, more public sector employees than private sector employees belong to unions, even though there are 5 times as many workers in the private as in the public sector. The American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees has approximately 1.5 million members, and the National Education Association 2.5 million, dwarfing the United Automobile Workers and the U.S. Steel Workers. The iconic image of a union member, the beefy white ethnic in a hard hat and steel-toed boots, is an anachronism. A majority of unionized workers are now employed by the government and are more likely to be teachers, police officers, and firefighters than carpenters, auto workers, and coal miners. This has changed the face of organized labor. At their peak in the United States, more than a third of non-agricultural workers belonged to unions. Yet at the same time, government workers counted for only a tiny percentage of unionized workers. When the conservative American Federation of Labor merged with the radical Congress of Industrial Organizations in 1955, few public employee unions were union members. Few public employees were union members. In government labor relations, civil service rules specified the conditions of hiring, promotion, and work. Legal barriers in many states forbade government workers from joining unions, and where they could join unions, union rights were highly restricted. All states banned strikes by public workers, and government employees were from populations such as white-collar professionals and women that had little attachment to unions. The dominant understanding, regardless of political viewpoint, from labor leaders to conservative Republicans, was that collective bargaining would interfere with the sovereignty of government by delegating a piece of policy-making authority to union representatives in collective bargaining negotiations. In other words, it would be a conflict of interest. In sum, before the 1960s, public employee unions were severely restricted and constituted a minor portion of the total unionized workforce. Most policymakers were hostile to them. In such a weak position, the leader of the United Federation of Teachers, Albert Shanker, referred to public unions' activity as collective begging. Beginning in 1958 and running through 1984, public employees' unions gained the right to organize and bargain collectively, with the majority of states enacting measures favorable to collective bargaining for the public employees. In 1959, only 3 states had collective bargaining laws for state and local employees. By 1980, 33 states did. The percentage of public sector workers covered by collective bargaining laws shot up from 1% in 1960 to 66% in 1990. Today, only 3 states, Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina, completely proscribe collective bargaining in the public sector. Utah allows workers the right to present proposals, which is more like a meet and confer law than collective bargaining. The rest permit it for at least some public servants. And most states have extensive legal provisions permitting agency shops and dues checkoff. Yet there is considerable occupational variation in which workers enjoy collective bargaining rights. For instance, firefighters enjoy the widest collective bargaining rights, and nearly 77% of them are unionized. State statutes were supplemented by local ordinances. The growth of public employee unions and their membership followed hard on the heels of the legal changes. Less than 10% of the full-time public employees were unionized in 1960. By 1980, it was 36%. That percentage has remained strikingly stable over the last 3 decades, as government workers' unions have consolidated their position. Public sector unions are now potent political forces in big cities, state capitals, and Washington, D.C. They participate in the development of public policy through collective bargaining, which empowers them to share in government's decision-making about how and at what price government employees will perform public services, and they shape public policy through their extensive lobbying and electioneering efforts. In recent campaigns and elections, the power and energy of the labor movement emanated from public sector unions. They are among the largest donors of money to candidates, mostly Democrats, but sometimes Republicans. at the state and national levels and make important independent expenditures on campaign advertisements. Consequently, in 2011, Republican governors in Wisconsin, Ohio, Indiana, and elsewhere sought to enact reforms to reduce the power of public sector unions. What we have then is a major political development, what political scientists Stephen Skrounek and Karen Oren call a durable shift in governing authority that cries out for explanation. How did public sector unions become the heart and soul of the labor movement and among the more powerful interest groups in American politics? I address this question in three parts. First, I explain the political conditions that enabled the legal changes in many American states from 1958 to 1984. I then analyze the patterns of state legislative coalitions that formed to pass major collective bargaining legislation. Finally, I discuss how the rise of public sector unionism should make us reconsider the traditional story about the decline, numerically and politically, of the American labor movement. And that was the introduction to Chapter 3, The Unseen Rights Revolution, from the book Government Against Itself. Thank you. Who is the socialist? He is the man that is spiritual. He's the man that seeks consensus. He's subjective, petty, and small, taking everything in life personally. He's outrageous, boring, and rude. He pretends to be a leader and a change agent. He pretends that he's your friend. He is sly, cunning, and deceptive. He dresses, acts, and speaks like a slob. He is informal and terminally unique. He is childish and pretends that he knows nothing. He has no conscience and pretends that might makes right and that the ends justify the means. He is impulsive and rationalizes his behavior. He is deterministic, blaming others for his mistakes. He is skeptical, demanding that others solve his problems. His unreasonableness and irresponsibility make him a bad role model, bad father, brother, family member, friend, and a bad person, period. So if you think that you can be friends with a socialist, think again. Thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there, and reminding you to tune in to the John and Ken Show, which is an excellent example of how true conservatives communicate. It's a radio show that's on KFI AM 640 from 2 o'clock in the afternoon to 6 o'clock in the evening, Monday through Friday. And that's Pacific time. So that's an excellent show to listen to. And other than that, until next time, remember to be honest, to be smart, to be beautiful, and to remember that the left has no authority, no power, and they can't win.